So welcome everyone to RISE, our Racial Equity Webinar, TPS, LOC, Racial Equity Webinar. This is webinar number 7. So welcome if you've been part of all of our previous webinars. We are so happy to have you here. And this webinar is sponsored through a grant through the Barra Education Foundation with the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program. We at DePaul are subcontractors on that grant, and I want to thank our Barra Education Foundation partners for supporting this work and for choosing DePaul. And we're just very happy to be here with you tonight, because tonight's presentation is one that myself and our team is extraordinarily excited to give to you, because we're coming to the culmination of our RISE program and giving you some incredible information and opportunities tonight. So I'd like to introduce you to our team. As before, joining me tonight are the brilliant Felicia Severi, and Felicia will wave, and also Stephanie Bennett, who is a doctoral candidate in DePaul University, and Dr. David Bates, who is an adjunct of DePaul and history professor at Concordia University, and I'm Dr. Donna Keel of DePaul University. And with that, I'm going to move it over to Stephanie Bennett, who will guide us in our norms for today. Stephanie?
Hello, everyone. So for today, we are going to create a space for everyone to engage with an open mind and an open heart. So it'll be good to stay present, to be fully engaged, and to share the stage. So if you have anything you want to say, just jump on into the conversation, that we're all learning from each other. Discomfort is something to be expected. So I'll just allow for that, and it's okay. Speak in I statements from direct experience. Assume positive intent, right? So when people are sharing, just assume that the intention is positive, and courageously name those things that are troublesome to you. And another good tactic to use is to withhold judgment and to own your own intention. So.
Thank you so much. As we begin today, sadly, we want to again acknowledge that Dante Wright, Adam Toledo, and all of the other countless people who have been killed as a result of harm and racism. The sad part of this is the last time we gathered together a month ago, we paused with our commitment to end Asian hate. And so again, we pause with yet another lives lost. And this week particularly, we want to take a moment. It's been a historic week with the verdict in the George Floyd murder trial, and a historic week on many fronts, but we want to definitely share our commitment to racial equity and justice, and especially share our commitment to the use of primary sources in that quest. But if we could just think about our history of our country for a moment, the lives that have been lost, and we'd like to just pause for about 10 seconds of silence in memory of Dante Wright and Adam Toledo and all those that have passed. So if you just join me in 10 seconds of silence. And thank you. And with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. David Bates, who will give us context for tonight's session.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. Just to give you a little bit of context about some of the work that we're doing and some of the things we're trying to share with you. Some of the assumptions of RISE and the baseline, guiding principles here. The first, obviously, is that examining history is vital to creating change, because this is kind of a cliche, but it's very much true that you can't move forward without knowing where you've been. But I think just as importantly, the way that you're engaging in history and the way you're examining it is critical. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is how you can use primary sources to engage with history in a critical way, and in a way that can disrupt sort of traditional narratives about how we learn history and how we understand history in a way that is hopefully empowering for you and for your students. And similarly, the way that you use primary sources in the classroom and the kind of discussions that you have are also going to empower students to create civic action projects and sort of spur them to greater action going forward. So I want to give it over to Felicia to go over next.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming. Again, we're excited to have you here. And today, our goals are to grow the impact. And we're going to grow the impact in the use of what you can find in the Library of Congress, the primary sources that are there, how you'll be able to work with your students and anyone to help dismantle racism. By using the primary sources from the Library of Congress, we have the opportunity of reflecting on those sources, asking, going within, inquiring what we're feeling, what we're seeing, the self-awareness with ourselves, as well as the empathy that we can help to create that will bring about civic action projects. We'll also, in our goals today, identify strategies on how to use the primary sources for supporting your students and creating projects, passion projects that are civic action.
Thanks so much, Felicia. And we're really excited about today's webinar because it really is the culmination of all of our webinars. And though we'll have another one in May and June, what we'll focus on is civic action. RISE in and of itself, the reflection, inquiry, self-awareness, and empathy was building that foundation. And if you're a K-12 teacher and you've used RISE, the intentionality is that each element of RISE was helping you to get to know your students through the lens of their beliefs about racial equity and helping them to dismantle racism through examining their biases, through looking at history and primary sources. And now that all of that has been established and we've grounded them in the skills of empathy, now we can help those students to use primary sources to be ignited towards civic action. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to give you a model of a welcome activity that you are free then to use with your students in your classroom. Use it tomorrow. We're also going to give you some research and information around the context of this activity. And then we're going to actually give you a lesson you can take, and we'll model that lesson for you. And with that, I'm going to switch it over to Felicia, who's going to talk about our welcome activity, and Lei Mao, who's going to put some information in the chat.
Okay, so with our welcome activity, what I'd like for you to do first and foremost is I'd like for you to think about what's happening in our world and what you've seen, that's happening in your neighborhoods, in your schools, in your communities, in our nation. And I want you to think about the impact that you'd like to make when it comes to racial equity. Now, there is a Mentimeter. If you go to the Intermeter that you should find over in the chat, I'd like for you to use 3 words that would describe the impact that you'd like to make in your life, that you want in your life to have others to see this change. 3 words that would.
Just to give you, if you haven't used Mentimeter before, it's an incredible, thank you so much. You're quick. It's an incredible free platform that helps you to do word clouds with your students and lots of other things. But if you can just click on that link that's in the chat and just enter your 3 words. And as you see the words being entered, like in any word cloud, what happens is the word that's used the most among our group is the biggest. And so knowing that it's very edifying for us, and Felicia chime in, to see that empathy is at the core, since that's also at the core of RISE. Go ahead, please.
And it's the belonging, when I look at the words like the belonging, the compassion, and I think a really big one in there underneath the empathy is the understanding, right? Being able to be patient, being able to communicate to the other, and willing to try to understand their point of view or their culture or everything that they've experienced. That's beautiful.
Thank you all so much. And we could probably keep going on this, but if you, we will actually share this word cloud with the PowerPoint after the session, so that you can have that and perhaps even use this with your own students. So as we begin today, go back to our slide. what we'd like to do is just, again, to frame today's work around civic action and what that means. And with that, we want you to watch a little bit of a TEDx talk that's actually from an educator here in Chicago. But what she talks about in this TEDx, and it's, if you have the time, the entire talk is about 11 minutes. What she talks about is really student civic action and how we as educators have an opportunity within our classes to change the dynamic of civics. So if you just sit back with us for a moment, and we're going to watch just a few minutes of this TEDx.
This I know, young people are amazing. I think that Kofi Annan would agree with me in saying that no one is born a good citizen, no nation is born a democracy. Rather, both are processes that continue to evolve over a lifetime. Young people must be included from birth. A society that cuts off from its youth severs its lifeline. So let's find out how you were included as youth. How many, by show of hands, in high school took a civics or a government class? All right, wonderful. How many of you then can say that you learned how to be active members of your community in school? Whoa, that's a lot less. Then I think that you'll agree with me, one of my students who recently said, I think they're supposed to teach us about that. Young people today are treated as if they should be able to, upon reaching a legal majority, go out and stand up for themselves and their community to serve the good of the republic. They think that when they turn 18, that they'll be able to do it all because they will have the imaginary handbook for adults. You know, the one we all get, the one that tells us how to do everything. Of course, in reality, that does not exist. And so they have no impetus, and they have no experience in being active members of our community. But you know what? They want to. Young people today are not disenchanted, they're disenfranchised. And they are that way because we see them as somehow unformed, incapable of doing adult work. Now, then of course, it should be no surprise to you that nationwide, more than a third of all high school seniors lack basic civic knowledge and cannot identify even one activity that would be a part of civic life. For our young people of color, the statistics are even more grim, with 50% of Latino and more than 60% of African Americans lacking in this basic skill as they graduate from high school. Well, what are we offering them instead? At best, they get simulation-only models where they can practice being adults and practice being members of Congress and practice being members of the United Nations. That is not to deride these important programs. It is to say that it cannot be the only thing that we offer them. We need to offer them practical experiences, empowering experiences, where they can lead and make change. All this is to make the point that young people, our kids, our students, they are not the future. They are the now. And in the now, what I have learned is that young people, and this has been reinforced time and time again to me, that young people are amazingly capable of leading and making change, of identifying issues, of organizing themselves, of taking action and making real substantive change.
And what the rest of the video does is really go on and talk about what she does with her own students. And what we're going to share with you tonight is really how to have your students become those agents of civic action, to take, especially as it relates to racial equity, to take what you've learned about using primary sources, to take all the skill sets of reflection, inquiry, self-awareness, and empathy, and take those 3 levels of empathy: cognitive empathy, where students learned how to think through what others might have been feeling; the emotional empathy, where students connected to what others may have been feeling. But now we take it to compassionate empathy, that motivation to act. What we know about the statistics that this teacher shared about civics is true, and that prompted the legislation that is mandating civics in our classrooms. But as she also shared, civics is more than just a learning experience. Civics is an action. And so what we hope to do with RISE is to help you, to help your students, to have that civic action that is also inspires racial equity and justice within those efforts that students can bring out into the community. And so what we're doing, as soon as I find my pointer, is taking the RISE framework that we've given you, the RISE analysis tool, and we're taking it to the next level, so that now students, much like you did in the Mentimeter that you did, the word cloud, is reflect on the impact that they want their lives to have. And so I'd ask you in the chat right now, what kind of impact do you want your life to have? If you're an educator or a leader or just a participant, what impact do you want your life to have? And you can please put that in the chat. Also, what needs to be done? If we look at and use inquiry to say, what's the change around racial equity that needs to happen? And then use our self-awareness part of what can I do? What really matters to me? What can I do? But please do feel free to share in the chat the things that are coming up for you as in your role, whatever that might be. And then how do I access that empathy to motivate and to come up with solutions? What we know from the research of Kenneth Clark, what we know from other research around emotional healing and empathy, is that it's empathy that really deeply connects us to the actions that we bring out into the world. And we also know that that empathy is often inspired by the context of seeing someone else's suffering. And the best source to see suffering is through history. And so when we look at using RISE and racial equity to inform a civic action project, what we've done with RISE is to now move RISE into 3 powerful areas of student motivation and student impact. One is that there's a personal commitment for the student around whatever topic of racial equity that they want to change. The other is that whatever topic that is, it will advance the equity for others in a group. And then finally, the third component is that it has a positive impact on a community and group of people. Those 3 combined give you what's on the outside of this diagram, that it aligns with a purpose for the student, that it provides an additional place for personal growth and all of those social emotional skills that we want to bring into our classroom, that it advances learning. Students have to become those researchers around civic topics, and that it grows civic activism so that the students can become those responsible citizens that change the world. And Stephanie's going to guide us in some strategies, in these strategies, to be able to use this RISE for civic action. Stephanie?
So there are 5 strategies that we're going to share with you all. We've been talking a lot about using primary sources in your classrooms and curriculum. And so we're going to share 5 strategies for you to use primary sources as you use RISE to engage your students in civic action. So I'm going to pass it to Dave now.
So the first thing that we've mentioned a few times, and we'll get into this in a little more detail in a bit when we do some modeling, is to make sure you're using primary sources. And so when you're selecting a source, something we'll discuss a little later is you can think about whether you want to select a source and provide it to your students, whether you want them to research and find it on their own. But in any event, we're going to go through in a bit some steps of how you can analyze a source and really dig into it and pull meaning out of it. And when I say meaning, I don't just mean literally the context of the source, when it came from, who it depicts, but meaning for your students, personal meaning, social meaning, cultural meaning, that can empower them to move forward with the kinds of civic action projects that we're talking about. So this is a very evocative image here. I just want you to take a look at this and kind of keep these questions in your mind. We're going to have a chance to actually discuss these in a few minutes. But just keep this in your mind, and we'll talk through, for example, the context of this image and what this might mean and how it might fit in. So I'm going to turn over to Felicia to talk about step 2 with another source here.
Okay, and on step 2, again, using the primary sources, we want you to look at this picture and really take in everything that you see, the people walking, you see the facial expressions. It's in step 2, we want you to inquire. And with inquiry, it's important to ask yourself or have your students ask themselves, what is happening? What are they believing? What are their thoughts in the picture? How are they feeling? How are the people behind her feeling? How is she feeling as she walks solo, holding this book and having all of this happening, all of this noise and chaos around her? And what are some of the actions that have perhaps already happened? When we go within and we inquire, it's asking those questions.
And so the next step is self-awareness and connection. So as you're looking at this primary source, now this is the place of introspection. So you look at this picture and you see the people, and now you can think of, well, where would I be, or where am I in this position, right? So this is where you can guide your students to plan some sort of an action, right? Because now it's getting more personal, right? So you identify who and what body in the community has the power to make the change, and then decide on how to make that change. Dr. Keel?
And then in step 4, we're really taking empathy into action. And so the reality in step 4, what you would do is to help your students implement civic action through activities where they are empathizing directly with the community that they're serving or with the individuals that they're serving, but it's that powerful place where students deeply personally connect. It's the learning that we know has the true transformation that learning is supposed to be. So if we push aside for a moment Bloom's taxonomy, and I was actually just having an incredible research discussion about Bloom's taxonomy was meant more for an industrial age. If we look now to a new taxonomy of learning that looks at reflection and inquiry and self-awareness and empathy as the skill sets that are needed for civic action, then we can use that empathy to guide our students to civic action. And that culminates then with step 5. Dave?
So step 5 is going back to the RISE guide and going back to the source and reflecting on the source itself, but also the project itself and what you've achieved and what more you'd like to do in ways of expanding it. And I think this is vital. I mean, pedagogically, obviously it's vital. We know that reflection is such a vital part of making learning, persistent and making sure students really comprehend and carry forward what you're doing. But I think it's vital for you as teachers too, in thinking about how the project went and some of the bigger questions, the thornier kind of nitty gritty questions sometimes, did the project and some of the sources you use cause traumatic reactions for some of your students, right? Do you need to make space for that in some ways? Did you provide the source for them, or did they find it on their own? And what were the pros and cons of that? Would you prefer giving them more context or less and having them find it on their own? So kind of thinking about these questions, and then also thinking about the actions that this spurred your students to take and how they can carry that forward beyond the classroom and into future projects and into their lives, hopefully. So Donna?
So there are some key elements as you think about implementing this lesson or this project in your classes that really truly shift the dynamic of learning. And the great thing is, if you are still teaching remote, or if you're teaching now in a bimodal way, so you may be in person and you have some students virtually, this racial equity civic action project using primary sources fits both modalities. And there are 3 elements that are essential in this civic action project. It's that student choice. So students are really using reflection, inquiry, self-awareness, and empathy to align their own personal beliefs with the action that they're going to commit. There's an authentic audience. So something that's really going on in our world, and sadly going on in our nation consistently, is our moments of racial injustice. And then there's an intrinsic reward in that students can look at this project as something that they carry on throughout their life, that gives their life purpose and meaning. There's a great also similar experience with a Barra Education Foundation program called Our American Voice, which really takes this concept at a deeper level and a more expansive level over the course of a school year. The concept is the same: to create students who are active citizens. When we focus in on racial equity, we take those incredible success stories of the Our American Voice program, and we fine tune them to really look and use primary sources in terms of racial equity, which really transforms you as a teacher as well. And I can't say that strongly enough. But when you get to really be that spark that ignites a student to change their life in a direction of civic action, it changes you in a very positive way. And Dave's going to talk about, I think, the next part, or we're going to model. Hang on. There we go. No, Dave.
So if we're thinking about the modeling that we're about to do, there's a few things you want to do to frame this lesson. So the lesson that we're talking about here is there's kind of some guiding questions for you, for your students, and a lot of these are difficult. And I think, as Donna sort of alluded to, they're extraordinarily powerful, but they're tough questions too, and they make you really think about yourself and your place in the world. But I think it's important to take some time and give some space for students to really think about these. The other thing that I think you want to consider is the source here is very important. So what source are you basing this on? And I think you want to make some real effort to make sure that the source is connected directly to the kind of results that you're looking for, the kind of feelings you're looking to evoke from your students, the kind of action you want them to take. And so I would ask you really to keep that top of mind, that when you're thinking about these projects, the source is really critical. And if you're starting from, doing like a backward design thing, thinking about these questions, I think you really want to think about what source would spur useful, maybe not answers, because a lot of these questions are beyond that, but at least useful conversations around these discussions. Donna?
So we want to model for you the lesson. So we've created a lesson that can take you through this racial equity civic action project using the RISE framework. But we want you to keep in mind that the lesson itself can extend beyond a typical class period and is adaptable to any grade level through elementary into high school. So the lesson itself has three main overviews. Three main objectives. So to identify what you'll share this with your students, and typically if you're doing both an in-person session and perhaps a virtual session, the priority is to always let your students know exactly what you're doing with a lesson and where they're going with it. So having this visually displayed for students is essential. So what you're going to do in the lesson is identify what they believe about racial equity, examine their own civic action passion project idea, and then launch a racial equity civic action project. And those of us who are teachers know that those three objectives will need more than just a typical class period. So the first thing that we would have you do with your students, much like we did with you, is to have a bell ringer activity that helps to ground them in both the RISE that they've completed hopefully previously, but also in setting the stage for a civic action project. And so what we've done with students, and what can work with any age student, is to ask them to select 3 words of how they want others to describe them as a racial equity activist. How do you want people to look at you as somebody who believes in equity in our world? So do you want them to see you as kind? Do you want you to see them as just? Whatever that might be. It helps to shift so that students have to think of, well, it's not just what people think of me now, but what do I want them to think of me? And so Stephanie's going to take you through what to do with your students about norms.
So whether you're doing a lesson with students or with faculty, it's important to establish norms, just like we did today. Our norm was to create a brave space and to ask you to fully participate. So this is something you can do also with your students. So what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And so Dave is going to take us through the first part of our lesson. Dave?
So when you're introducing this lesson, when you're thinking about this from a baseline perspective, talking about this with your students, I think the most important thing here is that first one, that it's something that has to matter to the student. It's something that they're invested in and engaged in. And I think that it's so easy for students to get overwhelmed, right, by the possibilities here and by all the problems that need to be solved in the world, that you might have to do a little work to get them thinking about something specific that really is important to them, but also something that, as you see in the third bullet, that targets a specific group of people, a neighborhood or a community, so that they're not overwhelmed. And I think the idea of thinking about a way you can help, right? A way you can start something, start a conversation, start an action is itself kind of a lesson, right? That it's not possible for one person to solve like racism, right? That's not something that one person can do. But there are so many things that can be done, large and small, by one person to move justice forward. And so I think you have to take a little bit of time at the beginning to frame this for students about what the stakes are and make sure that they're really invested in this, and let them know that there's going to be space for challenges in this, that there's going to be space for, bumps in the road, things like that, and let them know that this is really their project, that there's an element of creativity here as well. So when we're thinking about the lesson, I want to circle back to this source that we looked at before. And so what we're doing here, if you just skip one slide ahead momentarily, this is the Library of Congress primary source analysis tool, which is just observe, reflect, and question. So if we go back to the source, what I want you to do is in the chat, respond to this source. So this is an award-winning photograph. This is from 1957. It is Charlotte, North Carolina, and the young woman at the center of the photo is Dorothy Counts. And so she is one of the first Black students at Harding High School in Charlotte. And so if you just type into the chat, really any answers to any of those questions, what you see, what you think, meaning, things that you're considering, things that this reminds you of, the context, and then questions you have about what's going on. And we can kind of keep this conversation going. And there's a little bit of additional context that I can provide here that I hope kind of illustrates the kind of power that primary sources can have in the classroom.
And as you're answering in the chat, I think someone asked if the PowerPoint will be available after, and absolutely. And we'll make sure that those of you who want the PowerPoint, give you the link of where you can access that.
And you know what, can I just ask, it's like, I'm curious as to know, where did your eyes go first? When you looked at that photo, when it first came up, what caught your attention? What grabbed your attention?
It's a great question.
And what was the emotion, if you can remember that? What was the emotion that came up with that?
And some great comments in the chat of seeing a brave young woman, or seeing the horns first, or seeing strength and then seeing the horns again. And Christine's comment about loneliness, and Mel's comment about misguided students and a brave girl.
So when you're thinking about how a source can have power, how a source can spur things forward, something that you can do too is, there's a term that a professor once shared with me. It's called reading the silences, which is thinking in this case, what's outside the frame? What are we not seeing in this photo? So some things that you're not seeing. Dorothy Counts actually couldn't go to school the next day because she was physically sick. And so you think about the toll, the physical toll, not just the emotional one that this takes on the people that were brave enough to integrate schools. The fact that her family was actually threatened with violence, and after a week, they sent her away to Pennsylvania to go to a school elsewhere where she could go to an integrated school without them being the victims of violence. The other thing that I would say, which is something that I found fascinating personally, the place that my brain goes immediately is to her, right? Because she's just such a striking figure. But the second person is this guy, right? This grown man who's clearly not a high schooler. And when I looked at this photo, I assumed that this was just some angry guy locally who's marching along. So this is actually a Black man named Edwin Tompkins, who's a friend of the Counts family. And his face is so set and grim, not because he's marching with the kids making fun of her. It's because he's marching with her, and he's so disgusted about what's happening to her. And so asking questions like this puts your students in this critical frame of mind, thinking about what's going on in the photo, what's happening outside the photo, and to kind of, wrap up this part of the analysis. If you want to convince your students that primary sources are important, James Baldwin, the great writer and activist, is living in Paris at this time, and he sees this photograph in a newspaper, and it infuriates him so deeply that he comes back to the US to participate in the civil rights movement. And so if you're thinking about a real world example of primary sources leading to civic action, that's a perfect one that you can share with your students, that a photograph can pull people in and make them feel something that makes them want to change the world. And so that's the basic sort of Library of Congress analysis tool. And what we've developed here is another RISE tool that we use to go a little bit deeper. And the way that we kind of think about this is that the Library of Congress tool lets you analyze the source, so the context, the creator, what's in it. And the RISE tool is the one that bridges the gap between you and the source. It lets you think about your reaction. And so thinking about the reactions to this, what do you believe about this source, right? So what do you believe is going on here? I think the key question here for me, and a lot of you have answered this really insightfully in the chat, what do you feel? What does this photograph make you feel, especially now that you have a little bit more background about who these people are and what's going on? And what does it make you want to do? Is this a kind of a James Baldwin moment for you when you look at this image? So type a few things in the chat, just, whatever you're feeling here, whatever you believe about this, and maybe actions.
And I love the chat of, Molly saying, I want to intervene, that call to action.
And I think it's Andrea says she wondered if they ever had the conversation, if there was a conversation.
A great question.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the Raymond asks, who are they today? Which we're going to talk a little bit about in the next one, I believe. But imagine your own students talking about what they believe, what they feel, and what they want to do as a result of looking at a primary source like this one. It shifts your dynamic. It does open you up to that self-awareness and that empathy.
And I think, as a few people have said too, the believe question can seem a little bit abstract, right? Like, what do I believe about this, photograph that's, 70 years old or what have you? But a few people have noted that it reminds you of things you've seen or read about, and it makes you think that things haven't changed as much as they should. That's a wonderful belief. I mean, not wonderful in and of itself, but it's a wonderful response, right? That's kind of what we're trying to get at is, what do you believe about the world and how the world is maybe different or unfortunately not so different from this photograph?
And I love what Rebecca has said, that I don't think any of us are James Baldwin, but thank you, Rebecca, but that she decided to leave her international teaching job in China and come here because, yes, there is much work to be done. And it is the teachers who can spark that inspiration in our students, because as the video had said, the students are the now.
And I think too, you're also seeing some connections, right? That if you wanted to expand this, it's never just one source, right? There are other photos from this set that you can look at where there's one where someone climbed up onto a staircase. And so it's a photo of this, but from a higher angle. And you can see how long and how wide this crowd is. It's hundreds of people just harassing this one girl. She's 15 at the time, right? This is a girl. This is not an adult person. This is someone who's being harassed by this crowd and pushed around by this crowd. And the size of the crowd is just really kind of shocking. But somebody else noted, Marina, that the founding of the nation, right? That all men are created equal, things like that. I think about how powerful it is to put the Declaration of Independence next to this photo and think about how we're falling short then and how we're falling short now, and start that conversation with your students of how do we bridge that gap, right? How do we push this forward? So this other image here, this is a very similar image. This is from Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So this young woman on the right is Elizabeth Eckford. So she is one of the famous Little Rock Nine. And so she here's also, you can see her being menaced by this crowd, and specifically this very, stark kind of awful image of the white woman behind her, the white girl behind her, sneering at her. And so here we're thinking about the inquiry stage of the RISE process. So here what I'd ask you to consider is what kind of beliefs caused this problem. The problem in this case being this crowd menacing this girl who's simply trying to go to school. Why did this occur? So maybe doing some deep thinking with your students about, the long history of racism in the US. I mean, you can go back to 1619 if you wanted to, but you could certainly talk about the failure of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, right? The imposition of Jim Crow throughout the South. You can talk about the massive resistance to Brown v. Board of Ed. And then making your students think about, who do I need to engage to change the problem, right? And so you can do this in the modern sense or in the historical sense. In the modern sense, connecting those beliefs, right, about the world and the way it exists today. Where would you start fixing this problem today? Or you can have them do almost a role-playing exercise that if you were there, who do you talk to, right? Where do you start with this massive crowd? And again, I'd ask you to think about what's beyond the frame. What's in front of her is the Arkansas National Guard, and the Arkansas National Guard will not let her in the school. And so the only time she's allowed in the school is a few days later, when in fact the US Army is called out by President Eisenhower and they push the National Guard aside to let her in. So it's another really powerful image to get your students thinking about how they can connect those beliefs about today and those, you know, problems of the past and the problems of the present. A couple other things that I would just add here in terms of context and thinking about, you know, some of the ways that these problems manifest historically. So the woman back here, the white girl who's sneering at her, her name is Hazel Massery. And interestingly, she and Elizabeth Eckford actually reconcile many decades later. In the 1990s, they're brought back together and sort of bond over the fact that both of them really kind of struggle in life. That they both come from a poorer part of Little Rock. They're both very sort of from working class, working poor families. And both of them sort of had trouble in life. And Hazel Massery does apologize to her. And I think it's also worth noting, just as we talked about Dorothy Counts, you know, falling sick the next day, that Elizabeth Eckford has ongoing problems in her life, that she attempts suicide twice, that she's diagnosed with PTSD. And so, you know, I think it's important to note that these two people reconcile, but I think it's also important to note that there are real lifelong effects from this, right, that are suffered by Elizabeth. And I hate to end on a very grim note, but if you're thinking about connections between past and present, in 2003, Elizabeth's son was shot to death by police in Little Rock. So if you're thinking about the ways that these traumas kind of manifest generationally, I think this is such a powerful source that connects the past to the present in a very real way.
And it's a tool that Stephanie will tell us for that self-awareness piece. Steph?
So naturally, you look at these primary sources and you feel compelled to act, right? And so this is where self-awareness comes in. The change starts with us. So these are some guiding questions that you can use to help your students in their own sense of self-awareness. So if they want to do something about issues like this, how do they change? How can I change the situation, right? How do I want my life to impact the situation? What solutions can I create to put into action now, right? So self-awareness is a really great tool to get your students thinking to create an action plan. So I'm going to pass this on to Felicia now.
Okay. And with inquiry, researching the civic action passion projects and using primary sources, what type of projects can you help create with your students? And creating a passion project that surrounding people that we're targeting. What do you want other people to feel? What do you know? How will you know that you've helped someone? So it's basically coming up with an idea with your students, working with your students, your children, whoever's in your community, and creating something that you want to make an impact on those people that are being targeted. How do I say, okay, let's create this project so that it's a project that is surrounded by empathy, and we are communicating with them, trying to understand where they are and how we want them to feel, how it makes us feel.
Thanks so much, Felicia. And, you know, a couple of important things to note about using primary sources for a civic action project focused on racial equity is engaging the students and helping to pick that primary source so that whatever the source is, whatever the cause of the action really resonates personally with that student. So in our model example, we've given you some of the sources that resonated with us. But what you can do for students is give them options and let them select which primary source resonates with them, whether that's tied to a specific moment of history you're teaching, or tied to a particular discipline that you're teaching, or tied to the community in which you teach. The culminating experience of what we recommend in the RISE Racial Equity Civic Action Project is having students share their work through a showcase. So having students present their problems, but all along the way as well, there are opportunities for you to use the power of assessment for learning, one of our greatest tools for learning, to give students feedback. So when you first select that primary source and students look at the problems that they surface, you give feedback as well as the classmates of what is the identified problem? Is that problem at the deepest level that the student can solve? And you can do this with young students as well. And then when students either collectively or individually present their solutions, they get additional feedback from the teacher and from each other. And then that showcase, students demonstrate and put into action their project. One of the most powerful things that can happen is that those who are part of the project, that community or that organization or that group of people, can also give that student feedback. It really changes the way you teach students. It brings inquiry to life. It creates students who are researchers, students who are creators, students who are new narrators of the new story of America, where the students are the now. They're putting this into action, and they are becoming the change that they want to see in the world. And I know that may sound cliche or trite, but it's up to us as teachers. It's been certainly my life quest as a teacher to help my students become what they want to become and have their lives transform other lives. And this project, using primary sources, ties together so much of what's going on in our country right now, the divisiveness that we see. And we've seen examples of this, whether it's been the students from Parkland who led gun control rallies, or students in other places who really have taken the charge. What we want to do as teachers and educators is use the power of the Library of Congress to be that spark that it can help students to become that change. And thank you so much for everything that you're putting in the chat as we get ready to close today. We are always grateful to have you together, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Stephanie and Felicia, to lead us in a close.
So this is great because I already see Marina's already on the ball. But this is just an opportunity for you all to share if you have any ideas for civic action projects that you might want to do. You can just throw them in the chat if you can think of any ideas, maybe that we can share with each other.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to stay open to your students. It's like the TED Talk that we watched. Oftentimes we don't really engage our students, or we don't listen to the magic that comes from them. They see so much, and they're so they're the closest thing to being pure, right? Before they're like tremendously damaged by everything that's coming in from the social media, television, and that sort of thing. So listen to them, because they have a lot to offer in creating those passion projects.
Thanks so much. And if you look through the chat, we have incredible inspirational comments in the chat. And thank you, Marina, for sharing with us that you use "My differences are my strength," which empowers differences and work to eradicate stereotypes. And outstanding work. And Kara, your comment about the project helping students to have the efficacy they need to learn about stories and resonate with the trauma of the past into the present. I think that's really powerful. And I think that's where we as educators, regardless of your discipline, you do not have to be a social studies teacher. You can be a high school principal and use a primary source to help our current educators and students to see what's happened in the past and how it's impacting today, and how we can be that change in the future. So feel free, as we get ready to close out today, to continue to put things in the chat. One of our real calls as educators is to really be community activists and ourselves be civic activists. The reality is, for many of us, if you went to college and to high school in the 90s and 80s, you may not have had a civics class, because there's No Child Left Behind. Actually, before that, A Nation at Risk came in. Civics was often taken out of the curriculum. And certainly we didn't necessarily have action civics as part of our learning. I think today we can shift that. We can make that a priority. We need to bring that into our communities and those areas surrounding our schools and with our parents, so that it's not just our students, but all of those surrounding students who actively come together to be the change. So we thank you all for those creative ideas. Feel free to keep adding them to the chat. Thank you, Molly Cinnamon, for that comment. And we especially want to thank Sheila Smith, the CEO of the Barra Education Foundation, who is the grant recipient of the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources grant, and who selected DePaul as the subcontractor. I want to thank my colleagues, Felicia Shaviri and Stephanie Bennett, who are brilliant educators and brilliant civic activists themselves and champions of racial equity, and my colleague, Dr. David Bates, who is an amazing racial equity champion himself and a historian beyond compare. So thank you to the team. I'm going to open it just in case anyone wants to speak. Sheila or any of the team want to say anything to our audience as we close out.
Yeah, I want to know how everybody is feeling, whoever is still left on the call. I'm fascinated by it before or after.
Thank you so
how
much.
are you feeling?
Felicia, it's Molly. I am so moved by these photographs. I can't even believe it. And every week or every month we sit down together and we look at these sources, and it's scary because there's so many parallels to today that both it terrifies me, and it empowers and encourages all of us to keep doing this work, because we do not want to get there ever again, and never should have been there in the first place. So it's really powerful. So thank you.
Thank you. And I love the comments in the chat of Kara saying feeling activated, and Rebecca, I have allies, love everyone here. Thank you so much. We definitely have a community here. And Raymond feeling motivated, and Christine, my mind is racing with ideas and possibilities. You've definitely supported our team in that way. Yeah, our hope was always to inspire you to action and to have you reach out to you. And I love that Judy is going, I want to help my kindergartners stop. And to bring this to civic action. Please, please do. And we are here to help you. Certainly you can contact any of us on the team. You've gotten an email to get here tonight. So if you ever want any additional information, you certainly can use that email address that came from either Lei Mao, who's our graduate assistant, or myself. So thank you all.
And you know what else, folks? If you feel like you're getting stumped, if you get stumped,